I never thought I'd be the kind of person to betray someone I loved. But then again, I never thought I'd fall in love with my best friend's fiancé either. Life has a way of surprising you, of testing your resolve and your character in ways you never imagined possible. It all started on a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels charged with possibility. Sarah, my best friend since childhood, had invited me to a dinner party to celebrate her engagement to James. I'd known James for years, of course, but always as Sarah's boyfriend, a handsome but distant figure on the periphery of our friendship. As I stepped into Sarah's warmly lit apartment, the scent of roasting chicken and herbs enveloped me. Friends and family milled about, champagne flutes in hand, their laughter a comforting backdrop. Sarah rushed to greet me, her face flushed with happiness, her engagement ring catching the light as she pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It wouldn't be right without you." I swallowed hard, pushing down the inexplicable knot of unease in my stomach. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, forcing a smile. That's when I saw him. James stood across the room, looking devastatingly handsome in a tailored navy suit. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. He smiled, a slow, almost hesitant quirk of his lips, and I felt my heart stutter in my chest. What was wrong with me? This was Sarah's fiancé, for God's sake, my best friend's soon-to-be husband. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had suddenly descended over my thoughts. The evening progressed in a blur of toasts and well wishes. I found myself gravitating towards James, drawn by some invisible force I couldn't explain. We talked, laughed, and shared stories, and with each passing moment, I felt myself falling deeper into a pit I knew I'd never be able to climb out of. It was innocent at first, a brush of hands as we reached for the same hors d'oeuvre, a shared glance across the room. But as the night wore on and the champagne flowed freely, the tension between us grew palpable. "I need some air," I mumbled to no one in particular, slipping out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a welcome respite from the stifling heat of the party, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I heard the balcony door open behind me and knew, without turning, that it was James. He stepped up beside me, his presence both comforting and electrifying. "Beautiful night," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the twinkling cityscape before us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the party muffled behind us. "Can I tell you something?" James asked suddenly, turning to face me. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to bore into my soul. "Of course," I whispered, my heart racing. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to my lips. In that moment, all thoughts of Sarah, of right and wrong, of consequences, flew out of my head. I leaned in, drawn by an irresistible magnetism, and our lips met in a searing kiss. It was like a dam breaking. All the pent-up desire, the forbidden longing, came rushing out in a torrent of passion. His hands tangled in my hair, mine clutched at his jacket, pulling him closer. The world fell away, narrowing to just this moment, just us. The sound of shattering glass jerked us apart. We turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, a broken champagne flute at her feet, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Both of you." The guilt hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. What had I done? How could I have betrayed my best friend like this? Sarah fled back into the apartment, leaving James and me standing on the balcony. the taste of our betrayal still lingering on our lips. The days that followed were a blur of tears, recriminations, and soul-crushing guilt. Sarah refused to speak to either of us, and I couldn't blame her. I had broken the sacred trust of our friendship, had shattered years of love and loyalty in a single selfish moment. James and I avoided each other, both of us drowning in our own shame. But even as I castigated myself for my actions, I couldn't deny the pull I still felt towards him. It was as if that one kiss had awakened something in me, something I couldn't simply will away. Weeks passed. I threw myself into my work, trying to lose myself in the mundane details of everyday life. But every night, as I lay alone in my bed, my thoughts would inevitably turn to James, to the warmth of his lips, the strength of his arms around me, and then, inevitably, to Sarah's face as she caught us, the pain and betrayal etched into every line. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text from James. "Can we talk?" Those 3 simple words sent my heart racing, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through my veins. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and painful memories. James looked as wrecked as I felt, dark circles under his eyes, his usually immaculate hair disheveled. "I'm sorry," he said as soon as I sat down, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Me too. God, James, what were we thinking?" He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. Despite everything, I felt that same electric spark at his touch. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." I jerked my hand away as if burned. "There is no us, James. There can't be. What we did, it was unforgivable." "I know," he said softly. "But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was the universe trying to tell us something?" I stared at him, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to lean across the table and kiss him again. Consequences be damned. But the larger part, the part that still clung to some shred of decency, recoiled at the thought. "No," I said firmly, standing up. "We can't do this, James. We've already hurt Sarah enough. I won't be responsible for causing her any more pain." I walked out of the cafe, leaving James behind. But with each step, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind too. The next few months were a study in self-discovery and introspection. I grappled with my guilt, my desires, and my own moral compass. I sought therapy, poured my heart out to a sympathetic ear, trying to understand how I could have betrayed my best friend so callously. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. I reached out to Sarah, not expecting forgiveness, but hoping for the chance to apologize, to try to explain. To my surprise, she agreed to meet. We sat in a park, the same one where we used to play as children. Sarah looked older somehow, as if the weight of our betrayal had aged her beyond her years. "I'm so sorry," I began, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "What I did, there's no excuse. I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "You know," she said finally, "I always thought you two would be perfect for each other." I stared at her, shocked. "What?" She turned to me, a sad smile on her face. "James and you always had this connection. I think part of me always knew, deep down, that he wasn't really mine." "Sarah, no," I protested. "What happened? It was a mistake. A terrible, inexcusable mistake." She shook her head. "Was it, though? Or was it just the truth finally coming out?" I sat there, stunned into silence. Sarah reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not saying I forgive you," she said softly. "Not yet, but I understand. And I think maybe this is how things were always meant to be." As I left the park that day, my mind was reeling. Sarah's words had forced me to confront feelings I'd been trying to bury, to re-examine everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and destiny. Weeks passed, and I found myself standing outside James's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say, didn't know if there was anything left to say, but I knew I had to see him, to try to make sense of the maelstrom of emotions swirling inside me. He opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. "Hi," he said softly, stepping back to let me in. We stood in his living room, the air heavy with unspoken words and lingering regret. "I talked to Sarah," I blurted out, unable to bear the silence any longer. James's face tightened. "How is she?" She's doing okay," I said. "She told me something, though. Something that made me think." I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "She said she always thought we'd be perfect for each other. That maybe what happened wasn't a mistake, but the truth coming out." James stared at me, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think?" he asked quietly. I stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I think I'm tired of fighting this, of pretending I don't feel what I feel." His hand came up to cup my cheek, his touch achingly gentle. "And what do you feel?" "I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," I whispered. "And I'm terrified of falling, but I'm even more terrified of walking away." James leaned in, resting his forehead against mine. "Then fall with me," he murmured. "We'll catch each other." As our lips met, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt, the shame, the self-recrimination, they didn't disappear, but they faded, overshadowed by a feeling of rightness, of coming home. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be judgment, whispers, disapproving looks. Sarah's forgiveness, if it ever came, would be hard-won. But as I stood there in James's arms, I felt, for the first time in months, a sense of peace. Sometimes, I realized, the greatest act of loyalty isn't to others, but to yourself, to your heart, to your truth. And sometimes, that truth comes wrapped in the guise of betrayal, forcing you to shatter everything you thought you knew to find what's real. As James and I began to build our life together, I carried with me the lessons of the past months, the knowledge that love, in all its messy, complicated glory, doesn't always follow the rules we set for it, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to follow your heart, even when it leads you down paths you never expected to tread. And most importantly, I learned that forgiveness of others and of yourself is the key to moving forward. It doesn't erase the past, doesn't undo the hurt, but it opens the door to a future you might never have imagined possible. As I lay in bed that night, James's arm draped protectively over me, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the pain, the guilt, the self-discovery, and I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could choose how to move forward. With a soft smile, I snuggled closer to James, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat lull me to sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests, but for now, in this moment, I was exactly where I was meant to be, and that, I realized, was enough.